Hello, everyone. This is Scott Loveridge. I'm director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, and I'm your moderator today. Just before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. This is a webinar that will involve voice from just myself and the presenter, Dave Ivan, but I will be monitoring the chat box, so if you have a question at any time, please enter that into the chat box, and we will certainly make sure that Dave is aware of the question and has an opportunity to respond to that. Thanks for coming today. This webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to access it at a later date at the URL that's been provided in the chat box. Dave Ivan is our speaker today, and Dave conducts community and economic development programs statewide for Michigan State University Extension. He's spoken at more than 50 state, regional, and national municipal and rural development conferences in the US and Canada. He's conducted research on community sustainability, including a 2002 federally funded project called Small Town Success Strategies and a 2004 project called Can Small Towns Be Cool? His current research topics examine small community approaches to compete in the new economy and the use of social media to engage new players in economic development. Dave's work is recognized this past year by the Community Development Society for its current research award. So welcome, Dave. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. And the one limitation on the webinar is we don't have an opportunity, perhaps both from a time constraint, to share all of our findings. At the same time, oftentimes when I speak at conferences, I like to include some video feeds and things from these communities that unfortunately, again, this technology really doesn't allow. But our agenda today is really threefold. I'm going to give you a little background in terms of how we structured our approach in looking at this topic. And then secondly, we're going to spend the preponderance of our time actually sharing the results. What we found from communities that were experiencing some success in a global paradigm. And then lastly, I'm just going to touch upon some future research needs that we identified as we move through this process. I want to up front thank our funding partner, the Land Policy Institute, who through some funding from the Kellogg Foundation provided the resources that allowed us to actually conduct this research. When we sat down with the folks at Kellogg and Land Policy Institute, they provided some parameters. They says, you know, we're not necessarily looking for a quantitative analysis. Rather, we would like some stories. Communities learn best from hearing inspiring stories from other communities. And so from that context, what we wanted to develop or learn was really real examples from real communities. As we looked at our data set, not every community that we explored was necessarily a high-performing community. Candidly, some of the most innovative approaches, some of the best strategies are from those communities that are struggling. And it's their out-of-box thinking that is instructive to other communities. And so many of the examples that I share with you, you may say, well, you know, I'm familiar with that community and I don't think that they're doing that well. Exactly, they may not be doing that well, but what they are doing is not simply letting fate determine their destination, or actually looking at some very aggressive strategies and approaches to change their path. And lastly, we looked at the literature in terms of trying to establish some parameters of the investigation. And our colleagues at the Land Policy Institute did a number of base research that we were able to draw upon and exemplify in our particular effort. We looked at primarily smaller communities. We had an upper threshold of 125,000 in population, but the large majority of the communities were less than 50,000 in population. Candidly, most of them were anywhere from 5,000 to about 12,000. We looked to a variety of different sources to help us identify communities that, from their perspective, were worth looking at, including looking at Chamber of the Year national finalists and kind of teasing out some of their approaches. talking to state municipal leagues to say, what communities in your state are doing well. Visiting with colleagues at the National League of Cities. The Milken Institute has a whole database in terms of how they measure community performance. We took a hard look at their data. And then we also looked at various trade publications, some of them popular press, and we always see the best of, right? And so what we wanted to do was say, okay, does any of these communities that are being showcased in these publications, trade or otherwise, worthy further investigation? Because our funding was from an institute here at Michigan State, and again, from the Kellogg Foundation that provided the initial seed money, we oversampled the Midwest. So I give that caveat as we move forward, but I think that successful approaches, whether a community is from the Midwest or the South or from the West, are uniform. We all have different cultures, and I understand that, but I think if we really focus on the approach that they took, that's what's most instructive for these particular communities. So it's a qualitative approach. We did on-site interviews in more than 80 communities in 20 different states. In each case, we'd interview different actors to try to triangulate the data. We wanted to talk to city managers, community leaders, chamber representatives, and also John Q. Public at the coffee shop in terms of what their thoughts were relative to how their community was advancing. As in any qualitative approach, the transcriptions were coded and mapped against other community responses, and from that we developed some themes. And these success tenets were aggregated and compared against the pillars of some research that was done by the Land Policy Institute, as well as through the literature, to kind of say, okay, here's what the literature is showing is some of the themes to success, but how are communities actually operationalizing it? That's what we wanted to get to, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So that gives you a sense in terms of how we approach this particular research. So now to kind of transition in terms of our findings, I think just a step back, we have to recognize that global economic growth is occurring elsewhere. When you look at the global economy and we see the Asian economy, we see the other parts of the globe growing at a greater rate than we are domestically here in the United States or in North America, we have to say, you know what, we have to do things differently. We can't look at old approaches to our economic development to try to address some of the challenges that we're now facing in this global paradigm, this new economy, which is a term that's often used to help kind of frame this globalization that we're facing. One of my favorite quotes is from Charles Darwin. He says, "It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but those most responsive to change." Candidly, that's what we saw among these communities. They were responding to the change that was inflicted upon many communities. They're not sitting on their laurels, they're not sitting on their feet, but they're saying, okay, what can we do to add vitality to our community? And I think that their stories, frankly, are very inspiring. If we were to kind of compare and contrast the old economy to the new economy, in the past, we always sold our communities as cheap places to do business, right? Whether that be through labor, land, or otherwise. We know now that the new economy is really based on being rich in talent and ideas, particularly in certain areas such as science and engineering. In the old economy, it was all about attracting companies, shoot anything that flies. Now we know it's about attracting educated people, because that allows us, if we have educated people, it allows us to be rich in that talent and ideas arena. In the old economy, oftentimes if we had too many amenities, physical or otherwise, that added the cost of doing business. And if we were trying to sell our community as a cheap place to do business, it wasn't reconciling. Now we know that physical and cultural amenities is really the key to attracting these workers. People, and Rebecca Ryan out of Madison, Wisconsin, of course, says, this is the first generation that really chooses their community versus their job. And so that's part of the important matrix, and Steve Dower's done some really good work at Wisconsin on looking at the importance of these amenities to community success. In the old economy, success was really fixed in many regards, based on perhaps some natural resource that we may have, whether it be agriculture, whether it be mining, whether it be timber. And then our ability to compete was based on that particular asset that we were handed. What we saw in these communities was that their success was really based on their ability to adapt and learn, to do things differently, to be new learners. And lastly, in the old economy, economic development was primarily a government-led function. What we see among many of these communities is new partnerships, new actors, new stakeholders that are involved in community and economic development and advancing their community. So I mentioned that some themes emerged among these successful communities. And again, it parallels some of the findings that the Land Policy Institute and the literature identified. Really 5 pillars. 1, an environment that supports innovation and entrepreneurship. Secondly, we saw strategic investments by these communities to drive their success. Thirdly, strong social capital was present in these communities. Fourthly, they were focusing on their place and making their place better. And then lastly, these communities looked at themselves from a regional context. So what I'm going to try to do is unpack each of these. And again, our time constraints only allow me to provide a couple or 2 or 3 examples of each of these pillars, but it kind of gives you a sense in terms of how these communities are actually operationalizing it, what it means. Because what the goal of the research was not to provide theory, but to actually provide applied examples that these communities can potentially look at pursuing. So the first theme that we saw was, again, this whole commitment to entrepreneurship and creating an environment that supports not only entrepreneurship but innovation. And that's important. And I think it's also important to distinguish between entrepreneurship and small business ownership, because in a lot of communities will want to help small businesses, and we understand that, but entrepreneurs are different. They're committed to growth, right? And innovation is important because there's always someone who can do things cheaper. If we're going to be competitive, we have to be able to innovate. What we saw in these communities was that they recognized the interrelationship between both of these. And they stepped back and said, all right, what can we do from a community context to look at the environment that we operate in to help support that innovation, to help support that entrepreneurship. But really 2 things. One, they were focused on identifying and supporting those entrepreneurs and helping them to grow their enterprise. But secondly, they also, again, stepped back and says, all right, what programs, what activities, what attitudes do we have as a community that we need to make sure that we're aligning to help these entrepreneurs and grow this entrepreneurial culture within the community. A couple key characteristics that we saw among these successful communities. Oftentimes when they approached entrepreneurship, there was a local champion, someone who took it upon his or herself to say, you know what, we're going to keep pushing forward. I'm going to make sure that I'm moving our community in this direction. And they surrounded themselves by a number of individuals to help support that vision, but there was always that local champion. Secondly, they're building on their local assets. They weren't trying to be someone they weren't. They're looking at what assets they had in their deck and focused on developing them to the maximum level. We saw strong social networks in these communities, both internally from a bonding perspective, but more importantly, bridging to other communities across the territory, across the region, that help to open new opportunities. Fourthly, specific actions were taken to support the entrepreneurs. And again, that kind of goes to the point I mentioned earlier, is that they knew who their entrepreneurs were in their community. They had conversations with these individuals. They said, all right, what can we do to help you grow your particular enterprise? And then lastly, the community was very opening and welcoming to diversity and to experimentation and to innovation. And I think this is very important, particularly if we look at rural America, where largely it's very homogeneous in our demographic makeup. And so these communities recognize the value of diversity and the role that it plays in advancing their community. And then secondly, they didn't allow their own value system to rate or to determine whether an idea or an innovation is going to be successful. They supported all those different ideas that emerged from the entrepreneurs. So I'm going to give you some examples, and many of these communities are well known in terms of their efforts in entrepreneurship. But hopefully we're going to provide some examples that are less known. And I think perhaps the poster child in community-based entrepreneurship is Fairfield, Iowa. And the work that Bert Chudnowski has done, I talk about local champion, right? The work that Bert Chudnowski has done and the Fairfield Entrepreneur Association is really remarkable. You know, they recognize and celebrate entrepreneurs on a regular basis. They have an Entrepreneur Hall of Fame. The community as a whole embraces entrepreneurship as an economic development strategy. They have one of the most extensive mentoring programs I've ever observed in the community. And Bert shared with me how community entrepreneurs come together and mentor existing entrepreneurs. And the only thing they ask is that they'll those entrepreneurs that are being mentored will do the same to others. So a very structured and unstructured, in many cases, forum to allow sharing among entrepreneurs within the community. We know that capital can be a challenge in many communities. This small town, which is about 8,500, 9,000 people, has come together. They have their own angel fund, their own venture capital fund to supplement other funding opportunities that exist within their entrepreneurial toolbox. So they're looking at this very comprehensive. And if you look at results, they've been very successful. The past 20 years, they've created 3,000 new jobs. Personal income has tripled. So the matrix in terms of their impact within the community is very well documented. In fact, if you go to their website, the Fairfield Entrepreneur Relocation Program, they're not talking about relocating new businesses. They're talking about relocating entrepreneurs within their community. And if you look at many of the things that they talk about on their website is some of the things that I mentioned in terms of the culture and amenities, the quality of life, the access to different capital resources to advance their particular community. Very successful approach there in Fairfield, Iowa. Columbus, Indiana, a little bigger town. Columbus is a population of around 40,000 people. But and this was a National Chamber of the Year finalist. Actually, not only finalist, National Chamber of the Year winner there in Indiana. Columbus is about an hour from Indianapolis. I was very impressed with how their chamber, who is kind of the lead organization in this particular effort, is working to create an entrepreneurial ecosystem, really trying to hit on a variety of different levels. They have networking events called the Entrepreneurs Network 10. Here's a picture of it here on the screen. Providing the opportunities for entrepreneurs to connect with other entrepreneurs, bringing in guest speakers, but most importantly, after the guest speakers, the social interaction that takes place after these meetings is incredible. Again, individuals working with other individuals within the community. Research shows that a lot of individuals look for information to advance their business between 10 p.m. And 2 a.m. in the morning. That's when they get online. That's when they search for information. Columbus recognized this, and so they made sure that all their business resources that they have is very transparent, very available, putting everything online, no passwords. You just get it. We want to help communities, or entrepreneurs advance within our region. So they're really creating a virtual front door to the entrepreneurs, not only in Columbus, but across a greater region that they service. They're also drilling down to the high school level. They says, we want to plant the seeds of the future entrepreneurs. And so they have a high school business plan competition. You can see a picture here of some of the participants that award prizes based on the most viable business plan, the most innovative business plan. Again, trying to hit on a lot of different elements to create this entrepreneurial ecosystem. Been very successful. In fact, the interesting thing about Columbus is, they have a major employer there. For those of you who don't know, Columbus is a home of Caterpillar. Cummins Engine. Cat and Caterpillar, I get them messed up. Cummins Engines. And so oftentimes when a community has a major employer, we know that here in Michigan with the auto industry, it's easy to kind of get on a path dependence and look at that particular sector for your future economic growth. And what Columbus has done is they've stepped back and says, we're very appreciative and we're very honored to have Cummins as part of our economic drivers within our community. But at the same time, we have to expand that, and that's the kind of the genesis of their focus on looking at entrepreneurship and creating this ecosystem within the community. I see Greg Weiss is on the call, and Greg could probably talk about Juneau County, Wisconsin, and the work that Terry Whipple has done. There is really a lesson to many individuals that look at primarily rural areas in terms of how can we create these networking events that connect entrepreneur to entrepreneur. What they've done there, and I visited with Terry, is through the establishment of an entrepreneurship and innovation club, is providing the forum for people to come together, to share information, to learn from others, to help advance their industries. So often I hear from rural communities and saying, we don't have the infrastructure that allows us to provide that networking, which is so key. And I think what Terry has demonstrated there in Juneau County is that it doesn't have to be that hard. I mean, just by providing the simple format to allow individuals to come together, we provide that network, we provide that support system, and that outside expertise to advance their businesses. I've been very successful there in Juneau County. I'm going to give you a Michigan example as my last example in this particular area. Remember earlier I talked that we're seeing new actors become involved in economic development. Not too far actually from where I live is a small town called Westphalia, Michigan. Population 500 people. There was the faith community that became engaged in community development. They had an empty storefront in their 2-block downtown, and they turned to their youth group and they says, guess what, kids? We just took a lease on this building, and we're giving it to you as a youth group to figure out what to do with it. We're going to pay the lease for 2 years, so you have 2 years to kind of get a business running, and then it's up to you. And so what the youth group at the faith community at this particular church was able to do was kind of fill an empty storefront. But what a powerful lesson for these kids, right? In terms of coming up with the business idea. In this case, it's called the Ark. It's a sub shop / ice cream shop / high school gathering place, hangout after school. You go to this town after 3 o'clock when school is dismissed in warm weather, and the place is packed. The kids come there supporting their other kids, but again, most importantly, they're learning about running a business, and they've been able to operate this now. It's in its 5th year, been very successful. They no longer need the backing of the church, but they continue to be engaged in it. So again, new actors, in this case, the faith community. And we've seen that in a number of different urban communities where the faith community has also been very engaged in entrepreneurial development. So the second theme that we saw among successful communities was really their investment strategically to help advance their community. For a community to be competitive globally, it needs to support these new innovations. Part of that is looking at the education system that they have in place. Part of it is looking at how do we strengthen our human capital, not only in formal education, but in non-formal and lifelong learning. Also, they're looking at infrastructure. And oftentimes when you look at communities, the old economy infrastructure is water and sewer, right? Now we know it's all about connectivity. I was at a conference in Washington, D.C., just got back last evening, and there was a representative from the Obama administration that spoke to us, and President Obama just returned back from India. And this individual shared with us how they went to some communities, very rural communities in India, that had very limited traditional infrastructure in terms of water and sewer, and the sanitation and the housing was frankly very deplorable. But he says they were struck by the connectivity in these very rural areas, and they were able to get on their iPads and check emails and do all the things that you expect in a larger urban setting. That's what we also saw in these communities, that they recognize that, we have to make broadband connection a priority. And in some cases, they were very creative in helping that to be realized. In fact, the first community I'm going to emphasize is one of those that was creative, and that's Wenatchee, Washington. Wenatchee is a town of probably around 9,000 people, and this is kind of in the heart of apple country there in central Washington. They recognize that, you know what, we produce apples for the world. And therefore, if we are producing a food product for the world, we have to be connected to the world. And when you look at their investment, the Community Technology Center, you can see a picture of it there. You can see the satellite dishes. It's remarkable. And what they did was they actually used some legislation that's available there in Washington through the Harbor Fund Investment Act that allowed them to capitalize on some funding. Now, there's no harbors, believe me, in Wenatchee, Washington. This is a very centrally located community. I'm not even sure they have a river, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, they looked at opportunities, they looked at loopholes, and says, how can we be creative in bringing funding to our community? And the satellite capabilities really do link them to the world. In fact, when I was there, I was struck. There was a video conference going on with some researchers from Washington State University who have a research test site there, connected with researchers from Rutgers University in New Jersey, connected with produce buyers from Japan. So again, they're connecting to the world, and it's such an impressive investment that Yahoo, we've heard of that company, right? Yahoo selected this particular community and this particular facility as a site for one of their regional centers for the Western United States. So again, it speaks to the type of infrastructure investment that this community made, again, strategically thinking out of the box to make it happen. What we also saw in these communities was that they were looking at education, both formal and informal. One of my favorite examples is Houston, Minnesota. Houston's a town of approximately 1,200 people. It's probably about 45 minutes or an hour from Rochester, Minnesota. There may be some people from Minnesota on the, yeah, Bruce, you're on here. That can kind of give me a better sense if my geographic's right. But Houston, and their superintendent at this particular school says, you know, we have to enhance the connectivity of our particular community. And so what he did was he wrote a grant to the Mayo Foundation that allowed an opportunity to get some used computers and put them in households throughout the school district. And he negotiated with a local cable provider and a phone internet provider to get some reduced rates to allow these households that now had computers in them that heretofore didn't, to provide them a reduced rate to internet access. Their goal was very simple. They said, you know what, we want increased connectivity. The second thing is in Minnesota, like in Michigan and other states, they receive payment based on the number of kids that go to their school. They were looking at a number of individuals who were being homeschooled, that were choosing other alternatives. They said, you know what, we have to raise the bar to want people to choose our community. To do that, they developed a very extensive and aggressive online learning curriculum that really raised the bar in terms of what they were able to offer students. And they had to have some very eyeball-to-eyeball conversations with their teachers union because, again, we're removing their cheese to allow them to pursue this particular approach. In fact, they branded it, calling it the Minnesota Virtual Academy. And let me tell you, folks, this is one of the most extensive virtual online programs I've observed of any, particularly a small community in the country. Full complement of AP courses, 5 foreign languages, including Mandarin Chinese, which is taught by a PhD who lives in mainland China. Because of how they have elevated their educational offering in this small town, this small school, they now have kids from across Minnesota and a few out of state, but they're only paid for the Minnesota students, that are taking their coursework through the Minnesota Virtual Academy run by this small town. In fact, 70% of their school revenue is from kids who don't live in the district. And so they're using that money strategically. And I was impressed, too, as I talked to the students, as I talked to the teachers and the superintendent. They're very careful to also articulate to the students that, you know, Even our small town here in Houston has a first-class educational offering. And as you kids go off and look at furthering your education, remember that. Remember that even a small town can provide the type of education that's comparable to any urban environment. And I contrast that with a different approach from Sparta, North Carolina. Sparta is located in northwest North Carolina. Population, Sparta is about 3,500 people. And Sparta has a major manufacturer there, Martin Marietta, that really is the economic driver, that largest employer in the community, not only in the community, but a number of support industries that provide inputs to that particular firm. Well, they recognize this community as part of their assets analysis and looking at where they were headed, that if that particular firm was ever to leave, it would really be a body blow to their community. And they had conversations with the corporate folks at this particular firm and says, what can we do to help make sure that our community is competitive as you operate in a global environment? This particular community isn't nearby any major university. They don't have that asset to draw upon, but what they do have is a community college one county over, and they worked with the staff at that community college to develop a training certification program on advanced material logistics. That is not only for those who work at that particular firm, but also those who supply that firm. The goal is to say, we want to be a community of learning. And we want to demonstrate to those communities that choose to do business in our community that we're all about learning. That's how we're going to be successful. And frankly, what they're doing is really changing the culture among their residents relative to education and training. Show the importance that education doesn't end with a high school diploma, or it doesn't end with a college degree. Education is a lifelong endeavor. And we as a community, if we're going to be competitive in this global paradigm, we have to put in systems in place and encourage our residents to continue to pursue those type of educational offerings. A little closer to home, one of the communities we visited is Zeeland, Michigan, population about 3,500 people. Zeeland is not far from a larger metropolitan area, Grand Rapids, which has a history, a heritage of furniture manufacturing. In fact, today many of the large office furniture makers, Steelcase, Herman Miller, and others are located there in Grand Rapids. And as that industry has evolved, their workforce has changed. Many of the industrial designers that previously were on staff at these large furniture manufacturers are now contracted freelancers. It is what it is, but that's kind of the economic structure that this particular community was facing. And so they stepped back and they said, all right, how can we make sure that we capitalize on the assets that we have? Rather than looking at a collection of freelance industrial designers, what we want to do is kind of position ourselves as kind of the center for industrial design for not only the furniture industry, but any industry. And to do that, what they did was they recruited and hired a world-class international designer from California, brought him out, established this Industrial Design Institute that really brands this particular community, Zeeland, in terms of an epicenter of industrial design worldwide. They're conducting numerous trainers, bringing in designers, marketing the region. Again, looking at the assets that they have and saying, how do we provide continuing education to make sure that we're looking beyond just our immediate needs, but also the global needs, and providing the training to be competitive in this global paradigm. One of the biggest communities we went to was Dubuque, Iowa. And Dubuque has an interesting story. When you look at Dubuque back in the 80s, one of the individuals from Dubuque says, we were kind of looked at the armpit of the Midwest. That's an interesting characterization, but they had one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. And this town has really made a 180 in terms of their ability to reposition themselves for success in the new economy. And they shared with me how they're engaging young university talent. And I said, that's interesting because you don't have a major university within your community. Yes, they have a few smaller private institutions, but certainly not a major research tier one university within Dubuque. But what they are doing, I think, is instructive. They says, you know what? We do have connections to another university that's about 40 miles away. I said, well, where's that? And it says University of Wisconsin at Platteville. Actually, I think it's about 35 miles away. So they're looking regionally, right? Crossing state lines, looking at the assets that are available there, and then making connections. And so what they did was they established a young professional college chapter to connect with their local chapter so that, again, Dubuque is looked at the center of the ring to this university town. But they went much further, and I think this is what's instructive. They establish an internship academy with a few goals. It says, we want people to look at conducting internships in Dubuque. Because again, the literature suggests that if you have a meaningful internship experience and a productive one, you're more likely to consider that community and that particular firm as a future employer. And so what Dubuque's goal was to get people to say, you know what, I want to choose Dubuque. So if you're a freshman, it says, we'll provide a shadow experience. We'll connect you with a business person in our community, in our city, that you can follow along, kind of get a taste, dip your toe in the water, so to speak, so that you understand what that industry is about. If you're a sophomore, we'll provide a mentoring experience where you can call someone up, you can ask them questions. They're here to mentor you, to help provide some professional guidance. And if you're a junior or senior, we promise you a full internship in your chosen career that's meaningful, that you're not just filing papers, that's meaningful to what you're trying to accomplish. Very prescribed approach in terms of connecting with the university town from across the region. In fact, they've identified a few key areas where they says, we want to grow the capital, the human capital that we have within the science and technology area. And if you have a degree in computer sciences, for example, we'll look at providing a loan forgiveness for part of your college loans. IBM recently selected Dubuque as the center for as the site for their Midwest technical facility over much more noted communities such as Indianapolis, such as Austin, Texas. I'm not able to share with you today, but they have a wonderful YouTube video that really changes the narrative of the community. You know, oftentimes that narrative, and I'm going to talk about this a little later, really helps to define a community. And what this YouTube video shows is that Dubuque is a very vibrant community, a community that has a lot of young talent. Now, demographically, when you look at the actual Dubuque demographics and you compare it to what they're showing in their pictures in the video, they probably don't match up perfectly. But what they're trying to do is change the narrative of who they are. The mayor had a great quote. He says, you know what, Dave, the next 5 years is going to define the next 50 for Dubuque. So it's important that we get it right. It's important that we put together systems to allow us to connect with the assets and talent from across the region. And I think they're doing a wonderful job in accomplishing that. The third key pillar that we saw was strong social capital. Networks that strengthen the community bonds. Young adult engagement. Looking at the young professionals that they have in their community and engaging them in the community so that they feel rooted in the community. And oftentimes they're drilling down to the youth in that community and trying to make sure that they felt that they were a part of that community and that community's success. First community I want to talk about is Colquitt, Georgia. And this is a town in rural Georgia that has had its economic challenges, poor region of the state. And what they've done is really connected to the arts to help bridge those social differences that exist in the community. And this is a community that has a heritage of storytelling. And so they says, you know, if we could kind of capture this initially in a book, they thought, but the book kind of evolved into a play entitled Swamp Gravy that really made the community a regional destination. Thousands, tens of thousands of people come to Swamp Gravy to experience this play. In fact, they've been invited to perform at the Kennedy Performing Arts Center and other national venues. The important thing, though, that I was impressed with in Colquitt, Georgia, is how they're using the proceeds, the revenue that they generate from this play, to enhance learning of their school-age children through the arts. Very creative approach. It says, you know what, we've now been successful in this particular venture. So how do we apply that from a community development perspective to enhancing the educational performance of our youth in our community? I go from there to Pella, Iowa. Uh, Pella, population probably around 10,000 people, give or take, and those of you from Iowa on the webinar probably can correct me. Launched a campaign called Positively Pella. Very interesting story. You know, there's two major industries in Pella, or two large industries. One, the Pella Corp. We've heard of Pella Windows, right? Some of the best windows ever made. And then secondly, Vermeer manufacturing, great agricultural equipment. Both of these particular industries shared with the chamber and others that, you know, we try to attract talent from across the country. And we have a hard time retaining that talent. When people come into our communities, they don't stay for whatever reasons. And we have to try to integrate them within our social networks. And so what the Positively Pella campaign was designed to do was really strengthen that social bond of these new residents within a community. It's kind of like a dust-off, a much more contemporary approach to the old welcome wagon, right? In terms of how they integrate, they bring these individuals, introduce them to the schools, introduce them to various social circles, so that they feel part of the social fabric of the community. Been very successful. In fact, when I spoke to the individuals at these particular firms, it says, you know, they've seen a marked increase in terms of their ability to retain talent within their community. Now, obviously, part of that may be the economy. People don't want to jump around. But nonetheless, they did some exit surveys of individuals that participated in the Positively Pella campaign, and the responses were very strong in terms of their desire to remain in the community long term. The other thing I think is key that we saw in many of these communities is really drilling down to the young professionals in terms of making sure that they feel part of the community in the community decision making. A third place is really critical to that gathering place, if you will, that provides the forum for people to come together, to socialize, to interact, to have fun. That's what many of these individuals are looking for, and what we saw in these communities is that they were accentuating their third place. I think a young professional organization, a YPO, is crucial, and as I visit with communities, I emphasize that. I don't care how small your town is. Birds of a similar feather flock together. And so if we provide a forum for young professionals to connect with other young professionals, that's good for your community. What we also saw in these communities was that their engagement extends to these young professionals in decision making. And my example I'm going to share with you is Thinkers and Drinkers out of Youngstown, Ohio. And again, normally I'd show a video and you could hear their story directly from those individuals. But to kind of set this up a little bit, Thinkers and Drinkers, great name, right, is a group of young professionals that get together at a local adult drinking establishment. And what they do is talk about how they can make their community better. And individuals are encouraged to invite others from all walks of life, so they have a really diverse gathering to come to this particular session. And they write an idea on a piece of paper and they throw it in a hat, and then they pull it out of the hat and they talk about it. And then based on that, they come to some consensus in terms of, you know, here's what would make our community better in our conversation. And then what they do is they then take it to the appropriate, whether it be planning commission, city commission, park and rec, you name it. But it provides that forum to connecting with what the young professionals in this particular community desire to improve their community and the formal institutions that actually exist in the community. The other thing that Thinkers and Drinkers do very well is really changing the narrative. And these are the two gentlemen here that are very involved in coordinating the Thinkers and Drinkers, is changing the narrative. And Ed Morrison was just with us last few days. I borrowed this slide from Ed with his permission, and I think it does a nice job in terms of kind of framing this whole narrative discussion. You know, communities often move in the direction of their conversation. And so if we kind of complain about our community, if we piss and moan, and sorry for the French, about that there's no place for kids here, or you need to get out of here, then that becomes a narrative of the community. And that negative conversation often leads to the path that the community may inadvertently follow. And I'll give you an example of thinkers and drinkers. And they shared this story with me when I visited with them. They says, they were sharing their particular approach at a local chamber meeting, chamber luncheon meeting. And I don't know if you know the history of Youngstown, Ohio. Youngstown, at one point, was really a thriving steel-making company town, much like Pittsburgh. They had their heyday, and the steel industry, when it was at its peak in the 60s and the 70s, really provided well-paying jobs. Well, we know that industry fundamentally has changed. And the thinkers and drinkers were at the chamber meeting and getting ready to talk about how they get together. And they shared with me how the conversation at the table from some senior members of the community was kind of reminiscing how things used to be in their community. And if we can only link or go back to that time and when those good paying jobs were in our community, things would be better. And the thinkers and drinkers said,
Dave,
yes, go ahead.
Tim Malone had a question about examples of linking young professionals with middle-aged business folks to kind of inject new ideas and capital.
Yeah, and Tim, I'll answer that in just 1 second. So let me finish my story here. So what thinkers and drinkers says, stop it. Stop it. We weren't even born when those companies left our community. And as long as we continue to talk about how things used to be, we're never going to get to where we need to be in the conversation about where we want to be. So again, what they're doing is really changing that narrative. So Tim, to your question in terms of examples of young professionals linking with middle age, I really think that some of the work that Dubuque, Iowa is doing extends beyond the college age students in terms of the young professionals, but also those early career people, connecting them with middle managers in the community. Similarly, Columbus, Indiana is doing some good work. In fact, they just built a new facility right downtown. It's kind of a gathering place that connects some of the young professionals, wonderful young professional chapter, with middle managers in Cummings and other large firms in the industry to, again, provide that mentoring, to provide that connectivity. Because well, young professionals hanging out with the other young professionals, we know that they can advance their careers by gaining some learnings from those that perhaps are a little more seasoned in their field. I also think that some of the work in Fairfield I talked about in terms of the mentoring with entrepreneurs translates to a young professional. Many of these young entrepreneurs are younger individuals, not all of them, but some of them are. So we're connecting with more seasoned entrepreneurs. It's a great question. And some of you may have some examples as well in terms of how individuals are linking with young professionals. What we also saw in these communities is strong youth engagement in terms of connecting them with the arts and the culture, often using that as a venue, with the goal of trying to create a positive memory. Again, there's a strand of research that shows that if an individual has a positive memory of a community, they're exponentially more likely to rebound back to that community at some stage in their life. And repeatedly what we saw is that these communities provide authentic opportunities for the youth within their community. So look at communities like Bothell, Washington, a population about 9,000 people. There, and it's hard to see in this picture here, but if you look at this banner, let's see, can I take this? Yeah, here we go. If you look here, their community banners celebrate the youth. In fact, these are pictures of kids. When I went to the school there, the kid says, see my picture at banner at 3rd and Elm Street? These kids absolutely knew that their picture was up in their community. But I was even more impressed, if you look here, it's hard to tell in this picture, that's a picture of skateboarders. How many communities have skateboarder pictures in their downtown? Usually it's just the opposite, right? No skateboarding here, right? We might as well put up signs saying no fun here. What Bothell says, you know what, we want to embrace that younger generation. We want them to feel engaged in our community. New York Mills, Minnesota really has connected through the arts with their fine arts program and providing visiting artists the opportunity to provide a contribution and to provide that connectivity within their community. Dowagiac, Michigan is one of my favorite examples. Population about 6,500 people. They have a fine arts festival, bring in top-notch entertainment. If you're going to perform at the Dogwood Fine Arts Festival, you're required by contract to spend time in a school system. So we may have some jazz fans on the webinar. This is Charles Neville. We've heard of Neville Brothers, right? Art and Charles Neville. This is Charles Neville here jamming with the high school jazz band. So I ask you, how cool is it for this young gentleman here, these young ladies here, to be jamming with Charles Neville? That is something they're going to remember for the rest of their life. They're not going to forget that experience. Providing that positive memory for youth is very important in terms of trying to get them to rebound back to communities. Jonesville, Michigan, population 3,500, does this so well. They're always surveying people. They asked their senior citizens a few years ago, why is it that you stayed in Jonesville? What was it that kept you rooted in our community? Their top response was, growing up in Jonesville, we had a good memory. We had a good time. There were some job opportunities here, and so we stayed put. I mentioned that they're always surveying people, including their high school, middle school, and elementary students. 2 years ago, they asked their third graders, what was it that kept you in your community? Why did you stay rooted in your community? Top response was, excuse me, I'm speaking so fast, I'm not following my own slides. I apologize. So they asked their third graders, what is it that we could do for you as a community? And the third grader says, we'd like a rock wall. Sounds like a bunch of third graders, right? And so what did the community do? They built a rock wall. They listened to the community. But here's the interesting thing. Is, they're always surveying different people, kind of asking them to rate their community. One of their surveys, about 4 years ago, says, give us the rating of your community. They had the top response from middle school students. So they had a little focus group, and they said, what's going on here? We know what these middle school students said? They said, back in elementary school, we asked for a rock wall, and you built it. We tend to discount the youth voice. We don't provide an authentic opportunity for them to tell us, from a community development perspective, what's important to them. Jonesville gets it. Jonesville understands if we have a chance of these kids coming back to our community, we have to listen to them. We have to tap into them. And so many of your communities do this in terms of providing disposable cameras to the school children and asking them to take pictures, called photo voice, of what they like and what they dislike in their community. It really provides an opportunity to present this at a future city commission, planning commission, whatever, to tap into what the youth concerns are in a community. There's a lot of research in terms of what it takes to retain youth and attract families. One is to create career and economic choices that are appealing to youth and the younger generation. These are pictures from Ord, Nebraska, one of the communities we visited, population 2,000 people. This is their middle school youth entrepreneurship program, been going on for a number of years. 3 of their downtown businesses are a direct result of this particular program. We don't always look at entrepreneurship as a career opportunity. Certainly they are in Ord, and as well as some of the other communities I showcase. Secondly, evolve community cultures that are progressive, embracing of youth and the younger generation. So if we have a community festival, perhaps in addition to the polka band, which we have each year, we provide an opportunity for local garage bands to perform, because that's the genre of music that the younger generation is listening to. Thirdly, proactively link your community goals and strategies to the attraction of young people. And lastly, focus your development efforts on those who want to return to your hometown, that want to boomerang back to your hometown. Great story from Brookfield, Missouri, population 1,200 people. They provided a gift to each of their high school graduates. You can see a picture of it right here. And that gift was a mailbox with that particular graduate's name already written on the mailbox, John Smith, whatever the case may be. And inside that mailbox was a letter from the community, and I'm going to paraphrase it. It says, we're so proud of you. We're proud of your accomplishments and what you've been able to contribute to our community of Brookfield. Many of you are going to look at further your education. Many of you are looking at other opportunities and leaving our community. We wish you the best. We hope you gain new ideas, learn new information. But always remember that Brookfield is your hometown, and we have a mailbox already waiting for you. Well, what a powerful message, right? What a powerful message to these youth in terms of saying, we want you to come back. Again, remember that narrative slide that I borrowed from Ed Morrison in terms of changing the narrative. In fact, this particular kid, Sam Thudian, and many of them are so touched that they use that mailbox, to receive cards at their high school open house. What we also saw in these communities was strong quality of place, authentic placemaking in terms of looking at how they can make their communities better. It's more of this and less of that. We've become so commoditized that we really don't even need to put names on businesses. We know what business that is. We know what business that is. But what we saw in these communities is that they are committed to creating these high quality, high amenity living environments that are really key to attracting and knowledge workers. And I shared this quote with you earlier from Rebecca Ryan. And really this next generation of talent is the first to identify more strongly with their communities than their employees. It's really about placemaking, right? It's about making our communities and building on a unique history and identity to foster this community pride. And hopefully as we do that, we're also increasing social interaction within these communities. Teddy Roosevelt had a great quote. He says, do what you can with what you have where you are. That's what we saw among these communities in terms of looking at the assets that they had, not trying to theme themselves, not trying to be someone that they're not, but looking at the assets that they had and making their community better. Lastly, what we saw in these communities was that the regional assets were leveraged. And in a global paradigm, this is so important in terms of looking at regionalism and abandoning the zero-sum gain or winners-take-all mentality to say, how can we capitalize on the regional assets that we have? In some cases, they're looking at regional alliances, and some of the work that Purdue Center of Regional Development has done is really noteworthy in having these civic conversations in Indiana to explore strategic assets. North Carolina, again, I'll go back to the southeast, an effort there with the Research Triangle North, and the traditional Research Triangle is about here. This is about 60 miles north, where a collection of communities are saying, can we capitalize on what's taking place an hour south of us? And they've done a very good job in terms of capitalizing on those networks and providing an additional space for these businesses to exist. Really, as we look at successful regions, what they're doing is uncovering networks, providing that safe place to have this critical thinking and this complex thinking that sometimes is very difficult to do. They're uncovering their assets, and they're looking at networks through regular forums, and I think I've illustrated what some of these forums may look like. And then they're linking these assets to define new opportunities. Talk about linking assets. I think Peoria, Illinois has done a nice job in terms of using some federal stimulus dollars, bringing together the assets on one facility that includes Caterpillar, Bradley University, a medical facility, the city of Peoria, USDA, who has a regional facility, on one hub to say, all right, how do we link the assets that we have? How do we foster new innovation based on our respective efforts that we currently have existing, breaking down those silos. I really like what they're doing in Moscow, Idaho. Moscow is a university town, population, small town, actually about 12,500. What the mayor did, very progressive mayor, has really branded this as an area, calling it the Palouse Knowledge Corridor. This is called a Palouse Valley here. And what she did was she was able to get together some external fundings to put together a business plan competition. And what she did was she says, if you want to compete for the prize here, you have to work with students from another university that happens to be only 8 miles away, Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. And it might as well be 80 miles. The two universities just don't interact, or historically have not interacted. So to help break down that barrier, this particular mayor drilled right down to the students and said, if we can get the students to interact, hopefully that will get faculty to interact. It's been very successful in terms of breaking down these bridges. In fact, I read in USA Today about a year ago where these two universities are now going to be the first universities in different states to look at establishing a joint department. And I think that's my last example, and that's Columbus, Indiana. And I go back to them because, again, they're hitting on so many successful things. And Columbus talked about launching a regional initiative to advance individuals just one step up their through training and education on their particular career path. They said if we do that, we'll impact household income more than any other thing that perhaps we can do. And so what they're doing is working with 34 high school counselors on a regional cluster to allow them to do that. The interesting thing about Columbus, they received some funding for this initiative from the Lilly Foundation. Lilly initially came to them and says, we want you to focus primarily on the Columbus metro area. And they says, you know what? We feel if we're going to do this right, we need to look at this at a much larger geographical area. And they actually turned down that original Lilly Foundation, which was significant. Lilly came back to them and says, our bad, you're right. We need to look at this from a regional context and allow them to really build this regional manufacturing facility that's going to kind of serve as a hub to serve this 10-county network. So what can we learn from other successful places? They're creating quality places to live. They're retaining and attracting their people of talent. They're very welcoming of entrepreneurs, and equally they're supporting innovation, not allowing their own value system to determine if a business is going to be successful or not successful. They're supporting education at all levels, not just formal education, but informal, and trying to make their communities lifelong learners. They understand the importance of community engagement, and so they promote it at all levels, including involving their youth and young professionals in that. And they're very engaged in regional cooperation and really trying to develop a can-do attitude. Most importantly, these communities recognize that they have to know their community. They absolutely have to know their community. Before they can address the tough challenges, they have to know where their community sits. And so before their community is telling them that they're sick and they end up on a tombstone, these communities are having these conversations and saying, how can we move forward to address these tough challenges? So with that, just kind of as we looked at this particular project, I think that there's an opportunity for further research and really trying to tease out more this community-to-community bridging. And then secondly, I think Pellet's done it, but I think that there's more work to be done in terms of integration of new talent with existing small-town community networks, and particularly the role that social media may play into that. I'll be glad to answer any questions, and I apologize. I went a little longer than I intended to.
Well, thanks, Dave. And as people are thinking of their questions, I'll put up this evaluation and hope people can click on those to give you some feedback. I did have one question for you that I can ask while people are entering questions in the chat box or doing their webinar evaluation, and that's some of these communities you talked about, they were kind of branching away from some of the traditional mainstay industries, in a pretty deliberate fashion. And then some of the other ones that you talked about were sort of, trying to build on the core that they already had. So you talked about Columbus, kind of trying to diversify, somewhat, still celebrating Cummins engine, but at the same time trying to, kind of hedge their bets a little bit by moving in other directions. In contrast, you had Sparta, North Carolina, that was building on an existing company. Zeeland was building on an existing industry. Wenatchee was, going to do more with apples and do apples better. So, when does it make sense to do which of those strategies? When does it make sense to branch, and when does it make sense to build?
Well, and I think that's part of the community conversation, and certainly, we can speak from Michigan, right, in terms of would it have made sense for Michigan to abandon the auto industry, and a lot of efforts were intended to diversify our economic base, back in the 80s and 90s, and with, frankly, limited success. You are who you are. In terms of community relative to the economic drivers. But I think what we saw in these communities is that they took an examination in terms of, okay, if this is our primary economic driver, is this particular sector growing? Is it stagnant, or is it declining? Are there opportunities for this sector to grow if perhaps we look at it in a different way? I think, for example, Zeeland, in terms of the furniture manufacturing industry, because of efficiencies, um, isn't necessarily going to grow from a jobs perspective. So you have all these talented individuals as industrial designers, and so what they said is, all right, how can we look at this differently? And they said, well, let's not look at industrial designers just for that industry, but rather looking at the same principles for other industries. And so again, they brought in an educational component to allow them, and branding the community, to allow them to capitalize on that opportunity. So different approaches in different industries. And when actually, they're in the apple industry, they recognize that the environment, the climate there, provides them the best environment to grow beautiful apples in the world. And so they're likely not going to walk away from that industry. But what they said is, all right, how can we capitalize, in this case, technology, to make that industry even better? And so I don't know if there's a clear-cut, a yes or no, or a decision tree, so to speak, to guide decisions. But I think that's part of the community's analysis in terms of where they want to be or where they want to go.
Okay, but what then happens to Wenatchee if suddenly there's another, country that decides they want to produce that same apple?
Okay. Yeah, or we all start. There's some kind of a scare in apple. Apple cider has it's not good for you. Not apple cider, apple juice, which we've been reading about. I think from that particular standpoint, you always want to look at different industries and or different opportunities. From Wenatchee's standpoint, I think that they says, we're not in the apple business, we're in the food business, right? And so we want to make sure that that we have the expertise, the human capital, the built capital to allow us to be successful in the food business. Yes, right now they're producing apples, but I think some of the infrastructure investments that they've made in that particular community will allow them to be competitive in a much broader perspective.
Tim Malone had a question about the impact on local government tax base, basically when you're going away from brick and mortar to more virtual things.
Um, to be honest, we didn't look at that. That wasn't part of our decision matrix in terms of the impact. But I'm not sure that we're necessarily talking about going away from traditional brick and mortar in all cases. I think what we want to emphasize is that some of these strategic investments in infrastructure allow their businesses to be more competitive, to be able to capitalize on those type of trading while still remaining locally rooted.
Okay. Another thing that I was noticing, Dave, as you were talking about all these different examples, you touched on a little bit at the end, so but it seemed to me that a lot of the positive examples you found were of communities that were not trying to be something they weren't. It kind of slid by on one of your slides, but you had Fairfield, Iowa, talking about being Silicon Valley. They weren't going to be Silicon Valley; they were going to be Silicon Valley, or Colquitt, Georgia. Just kind of taking something that's generally regarded as a negative, a swamp, and just turning that into a bit of a celebration of itself. Do you see that as kind of a defining characteristic of these communities that are more successful, that they're sort of comfortable in their own skin?
Yeah, and I think that that's the point I tried to make in that last slide. The tombstone in terms of community saying I was sick. And what I'm trying to illustrate is that we do have to know our community, and part of knowing that community is being authentic to who we are. We can't invent ourselves to be someone if we don't have the assets that support. Otherwise, the trajectory is going to be very difficult. And so we have to build upon those assets, but perhaps we do that in a creative and different way. And that's what some of these communities did. They looked at the assets that they had and said, how can we look at it from a global lens differently than perhaps how we've looked at it in the past?
Okay, great. Well, I think the webinar evaluation votes have kind of gone quiet here, so I'll pull that off. And and give folks just like one last chance to get something into the chat box before we close. My thing says multiple attendees are typing, so we'll just hang on for another second or two here and see what comes through. Well, there were a couple questions about follow-up, and this will be posted along with Dave's slides on our website, and you've got Dave's address there too if you want to get more. Do you have a formally written up study at this point, Dave?
I do. I do. I have a white paper. It's a little bit more academic and provides some of the theoretical underpinning to this. It also provides a little deeper dive in some of these stories that you really don't are able to share on a webinar per se. So maybe Scott, we can post it at the center's website, or if people want to send me an email, I'll be glad to send that out to them.
Sure, we can just put that right with your. We've done that a couple cases where people have had supplemental material, and we can just put that right next to your webinar archive site there. Okay, I don't see anyone else typing now. So some nice congratulatory comments and a reference for you to look at, Dave.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with what the Boom book, Boomtown and Schultz, his first name. We've visited a number of occasions.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for a great presentation. I'm going to turn off the recording now.